The ballroom glittered like a jewel set against the velvet darkness of a winter's evening, chandeliers spilling molten gold over the throng of well-dressed guests, their laughter rising and falling like the swell of a practiced orchestra. Every gown shimmered with silk and taffeta, every jewel caught the light and refracted it into 100 sparkling fragments, yet amidst the sea of opulence she moved as though she were draped in shadows rather than satin. Her dress, plain and modest, whispered of careful thrift rather than the extravagance the evening demanded, and in the court of society, this was a language everyone understood, a language of exclusion and silent scorn. From the moment she stepped across the polished marble floor, gloved fingers clutching a fan that had never seen the weight of envy, she felt the subtle, poisonous hum of judgment. Whispers fluttered behind gilded fans and beneath painted fans of auburn hair, delicate heads tilting ever so slightly as eyes measured, compared, dismissed. "Who is that? Surely a distant cousin of some minor baronet?" one lady murmured, her voice thin and sharp, slicing through the soft strains of the string quartet. The heroine bowed her head slightly, an acknowledgment neither of pride nor fear, but of the fragile dignity she clung to in the face of scrutiny. Across the room the Duke observed. Tall, broad-shouldered, his presence commanded attention without demand. He stood as though carved from marble, yet the warmth in his gaze betrayed an interest not common to his station. The court expected him to remain aloof, to engage with those whose jewels and silk were sufficient proof of breeding and fortune. Yet the sight of her, alone and unadorned, stirred something he had long denied himself: curiosity, intrigue, and perhaps most dangerous of all, a quiet admiration. He noted the tilt of her chin, the way her eyes avoided the sharp gaze of society yet held a spark that seemed immune to ridicule. The scorn was immediate and unrelenting. A woman in violet velvet, rich and imperious, swept past with a rustle of fabric and a barely disguised smirk. "Plain as a country maid," she whispered to her companion, a man whose jeweled cufflinks caught the light as he laughed. The words were meant to sting, to remind the heroine of her place, or lack thereof, among the glittering elite. Yet she bore it with a grace that only sharpened the contrast between her modesty and their arrogance. Her heart beat in quiet defiance, each pulse a small rebellion against the invisible chains of expectation. A young man, eager for gossip yet unpracticed in subtlety, leaned forward, pointing discreetly with a quivering finger. "She dares to attend in that attire? Surely some mistake," he breathed, and the room's collective gaze followed his gesture. Her cheeks warmed, but not with shame alone. There was a flicker of something more, a seed of determination, a promise to herself that she would not be reduced entirely to the sum of society's derision. The Duke's eyes lingered longer than propriety allowed, and in that lingering she became a cipher, a question mark in the midst of certainty. The room's brilliance seemed to dull in comparison to the quiet intensity of her presence. She was a single candle in a hall of sunlit mirrors, fragile yet unignorable. He shifted slightly, a subtle signal to his friend across the room, one that spoke of intrigue, of interest, of a recklessness veiled in the calm of nobility. And as the night unfolded, the music swelled, and the dancers twirled in their choreographed elegance, she remained at the periphery, an unassuming figure amid opulence, yet the center of a gaze that defied expectation. The whispers continued, sharp as winter air, but beneath them, a new tension began to hum, a quiet, dangerous electricity that promised more than polite glances and curt nods. Somewhere in the shadows of laughter and candlelight, the stage for a reckoning had been set, and neither society nor the heroine would emerge from it unchanged. In that first breath-held hour, she learned the cruel lesson of appearances, and he recognized the perilous allure of something, or someone, worth defying the world for. The ballroom, dazzling and cruel, had revealed its first truth. In a place where beauty was currency and conformity demanded, a plain gown could become a lightning rod, and a single glance might challenge an empire of expectation. The music rose, a crescendo that seemed to echo the quickened beat of hearts and the whispered currents of scandal yet to come. And in that swelling, the eyes of the Duke and the heroine met, and for a moment the room faded. A quiet understanding passed between them. The dance of society was perilous, but there was a promise in daring to step beyond its boundaries. The night had begun, the judgments had been cast, and the first stones of a formidable yet tender intrigue had been laid. She in her modesty and he in his restrained daring were now inextricably linked by the gaze of a world that refused to look away. The following evening brought with it a hush that seemed almost conspiratorial, the air thick with the promise of frost and whispered secrets. The heroine lingered in her modest drawing-room, the fading light of a gas lamp casting soft shadows across the delicate folds of her gown. She had not expected to be noticed again, nor had she wished it, yet the memory of the Duke's gaze from the ball lingered like a persistent candle flame, warm and impossible to ignore. It was then that the first token arrived. A discreet knock at the door, soft yet deliberate, announced the courier who delivered a small, exquisitely wrapped package. Inside lay a handkerchief of the finest linen, embroidered with a single delicate violet at its center, a flower chosen, she later discovered, for its symbolism of modesty and devotion. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded it, the texture finer than anything she had ever touched, a whisper of elegance and attention that made her pulse quicken. The gesture was simple, almost imperceptible, yet it carried with it an audacity that the rigid rules of society could scarcely comprehend. By the following morning, the token had stirred the fragile ecosystem of the ton. Whispered comments in parlors and along carriage rides spiraled into speculation. "Have you seen? The Duke, such a gentleman, sending a gift to her?" one lady said, her voice trembling more with curiosity than propriety. "Surely, there must be some mistake or scandal beyond our imagining," murmured another, glancing around as though the walls themselves might overhear. The heroine, careful to conceal her own emotions, felt both the thrill and the weight of attention pressing upon her, a duality of pleasure and fear that left her heart in precarious orbit. The Duke, for his part, remained composed in the public eye, his expression one of polite detachment when confronted with inquiries. Yet in private, his mind lingered on her, analyzing each gesture, each quiet word exchanged in fleeting encounters. He had never been so compelled by a soul so unassuming, so utterly untrained in the art of intrigue, yet there was a magnetism in her poise, a subtle defiance that both enraged and fascinated him. He began to navigate the treacherous currents of society with care, risking scandal to see that small, quiet spark nurtured. One afternoon they met, entirely by chance or so it seemed, in the sun-dappled gardens of a sprawling estate. She walked among the flower-beds, her gloved hands clasping a borrowed parasol, while he approached along the gravel path with a measured ease that betrayed nothing of the storm beneath his composure. "I trust this finds you well," he said, bowing slightly, and in that motion there was a deliberate intimacy, a violation of the rigid protocols that governed their world. The heroine's pulse quickened, but her reply was measured, polite, careful. "I am well, thank you, Your Grace," she said, though her eyes betrayed the trembling excitement she could not entirely conceal. Their encounters became a subtle game of glances, discreet notes, and fleeting gestures that carried the weight of daring. A silk ribbon left upon a gate, a pressed violet tucked into a book, a half-smile that lingered just beyond the scrutiny of chaperones, all small rebellions against the suffocating rigidity of their environment. Each token, each shared moment heightened the stakes, drawing both admiration and suspicion. Society, predictably, did not remain silent. Rumors grew like ivy over the polished facades of stately homes. "Have you heard? The Duke, known for his impeccable discretion, is seen lingering near her lodgings," one gentleman whispered during a card game. "It cannot be proper, nor is it safe," another said, fingering the edge of his cigar with more anxiety than concern for propriety warranted. The heroine, hearing of these murmurs, felt a mixture of indignation and fear. She had never sought attention, and yet, in accepting kindness, even one as delicate as an embroidered handkerchief, she had become a fulcrum for society's fascination and censure. Still, in the quiet of her room, she pressed the violet-lined linen to her heart, recognizing the courage embedded in such a gesture. The Duke, she realized, was wagering not merely reputation but the fragile trust of his station on a sentiment that defied convention. And in that recognition her own heart stirred, a cautious flame ignited by audacity and care. Even as the gossip swirled and the hallways of the ton echoed with speculation, a subtle tension began to coil between them, a delicate, unspoken promise that something more dangerous, more profound than admiration or fleeting intrigue was taking root. Each glance carried risk, each gesture could precipitate scandal. Yet neither could resist the draw of the other's presence, the quiet electricity that passed in shared silences, in notes slipped beneath doors, in hands brushing ever so briefly in crowded corridors. By the close of the week, it was undeniable. Society's watchful eye had been drawn, like moths to a flame, and the heroine found herself at the center of an invisible storm. And yet, amid the whispers, the envy, and the shrewdly veiled insults, she experienced a thrill she had never known, the awareness that a single, deliberate act of kindness had shattered the monotony of a world built upon wealth and appearances, and had carved a space where two souls, unyielding and wary, might meet, unseen yet profoundly recognized. The tension lingered as evening fell once more, lanterns flickering along the cobblestone paths, the chill of winter brushing against the windows, and the heroine, clutching her delicate token, could not help but wonder what audacity the Duke might display next, and whether society's scrutiny would permit such courage to endure. Rain fell in a delicate, relentless patter, tapping against the tall windows of the garden pavilion with a rhythm that mirrored the heroine's racing pulse. The evening had drawn in with a leaden sky, the storm muttering low over the estate, and she had found herself wandering the stone pathways, seeking refuge among the neatly clipped hedges and the faint fragrance of winter blooms. It was there, in the shadowed shelter of the pavilion, that he appeared, a silhouette cut sharply against the silver wash of rain, the Duke moving with an ease that suggested both command and careful restraint. "Your Grace," she began, curtsying with all the composure she could summon, though her heart threatened to betray her. "You honor me with your presence, though the storm might prefer we remain apart." Her voice, steady at the outset, quavered slightly under the weight of anticipation, and he observed her closely, noting the subtle tremor of her hands beneath the lace cuffs. "It is no mere honor," he said, his tone measured, yet carrying a warmth that few would have dared to imagine from a man of his station. "It is a necessity. I cannot abide that a matter so singular should remain unspoken." His words, deliberate and precise, hung between them, the air taut with unvoiced meaning. She lifted her gaze, finding his eyes, those deep pools of observation, guarded yet intense, searching her own. "I do not understand," she whispered, the rain providing a gentle percussion that seemed to shield them from prying ears. "Singular, sir?" He stepped closer, the space between them contracting, yet not intrusively, as if every movement had been choreographed by propriety itself. "You," he said simply. "Your presence, your temperance, your dignity in the face of scrutiny, it has unsettled me more than I could have believed possible." His confession was almost a caress, a dangerous revelation cloaked in the guise of civility. The heroine's heart thudded, a mixture of fear, exhilaration, and disbelief. "And yet," she breathed, "to whom do we owe such candor? The world would not forgive such liberties." She gestured vaguely toward the estate beyond the pavilion, where shadows hinted at the staff's watchful eyes, the occasional flicker of lanterns betraying the omnipresent gaze of society. He inclined his head, acknowledging both the truth of her words and the risk inherent in their meeting. "I am not concerned with the world," he admitted, his voice dropping to a level meant only for her ears. "I am concerned with this, what passes between us in stolen moments, in glances, in letters pressed beneath doors. It is a matter I can neither ignore nor restrain, and it has become intolerable to my reason to do so." A shiver ran down her spine, not from cold, but from the raw intensity in his gaze. She took a measured step closer, feeling the storm's chill recede in the heat of his attention. "Then," she whispered, "we are most indiscreet." There was a trembling humor in her voice, yet it could not mask the gravity of their mutual recognition. He allowed himself the faintest of smiles, one that seemed to illuminate the pavilion despite the gray world beyond. "Perhaps," he said, "but indiscretion is a small price to pay when weighed against truth." The words settled over her like a warm mantle, comforting yet electrifying, and she realized that the world outside, the gossip, the judgment, the expectation, had faded into irrelevance. For several minutes, they spoke in a quiet cadence, carefully measured but laden with feeling, words chosen with precision to conceal yet reveal, to guard yet confess. She learned of his admiration, of the countless moments he had spent observing her fortitude, the careful consideration he had given to every gesture, every word she had offered in return. And she, in turn, allowed herself a tentative admission, that she too had been captivated, terrified, yet quietly exhilarated by the attention of a man so esteemed and so improbable in his regard. The rain softened, turning to a gentle mist that clung to the stone beneath their feet. He extended his gloved hand, not in formality, but in an invitation to shared courage, an offer of connection that dared to defy propriety. She accepted it, fingertips brushing against his in a contact charged with both restraint and yearning. In that touch, a fragile understanding passed between them, that whatever storms society might conjure, they would face them together, bound by the daring acknowledgement of hearts no longer willing to remain silent. And then, as the wind whispered through the pines and the last drops of rain clung to the lattice of the pavilion, the moment fractured, not violently, but with the delicate tension of anticipation. A distant lantern flickered, a servant's shadow passed too near, and the heroine knew with a bittersweet certainty that the world beyond would not forgive this meeting. Yet within that fleeting hour, they had carved a sanctuary of truth, fragile but undeniable, and the promise of what might come pulsed between them, vibrant, terrifying, and intoxicating. She released his hand reluctantly, a shiver of longing tracing her spine, and met his gaze with a silent question. He answered only with a small, steadfast nod, their private confession sealed, their fates intertwined, and the shadow of scandal yet to fall over them waiting, patient and inevitable. The ballroom was ablaze with light, a constellation of chandeliers casting molten gold across the polished floors and the glittering assembly of society's finest. Conversations hummed, laughter tinkled, and the soft music of the orchestra wrapped the air like a silken veil. Yet, amid this tapestry of wealth and expectation, all eyes, though none dared openly, were drawn to the unassuming figure standing at the periphery, her modest gown no less striking for its simplicity than any bejeweled creation. She moved with the quiet dignity that had always distinguished her, gloved hands folded before her, posture impeccable, yet each measured step carried the weight of countless whispers and prying glances. He approached her with a deliberate calm, a man accustomed to command yet now yielding entirely to the gravity of what must be done. Every observer of the ton, attuned to the social choreography, felt the shift in air, the subtle tension that heralded the breach of etiquette. The Duke, long the epitome of poise and discretion, had decided that propriety would bow to the dictates of the heart. His eyes met hers, and in that look, 1,000 unspoken words passed, the quiet affirmation of danger embraced, the steadfast recognition of worth, and the audacity to defy expectation. "May I have this dance?" His words were neither boast nor plea, but a declaration sharp and deliberate in their effect. The music, coincidentally or by fate, swelled in perfect accord as she hesitated, caught between fear and desire. Around them, the ballroom's denizens faltered, whispering in disbelief, fans fluttering as though the air itself could carry gossip faster than thought. The heroine's pulse quickened, yet she lifted her chin and inclined her head, answering him with grace tempered by courage. They moved to the center of the floor, bodies aligned in the formal rhythm of a waltz, yet every step they took spoke of defiance and connection beyond the scrutiny of onlookers. With each turn, each measured glide across polished marble, the Duke's hand at her back steadied not only her form but the unspoken assurance that she was seen and chosen, not as ornament or curiosity, but as the equal of his admiration and daring. Their faces, close yet respectful, carried the fire of unspoken sentiment, the quiet explosion of longing restrained until this moment of public declaration. The assembly could not ignore them. Eyes widened, hands paused mid-gesture, and the delicate web of whispers transformed into an undercurrent of fascination. "It cannot be proper," one matron hissed behind her fan, yet her voice trembled as though betraying a grudging admiration. Yet propriety and rumor held no sway here. The Duke's steady gaze and the heroine's poised acceptance created a tableau in which social rules bent, if not shattered entirely. "Let the world speak as it pleases," he murmured, just enough for her to hear, his voice low but resonant, a private vow amidst the public spectacle. "There are matters of the heart that no etiquette can contain." Her fingers brushed his, the brief contact a subtle but explosive affirmation of mutual courage. And in that gesture, the ballroom, the chandeliers, the prying eyes, all of it, faded into insignificance. As the dance concluded, the Duke inclined his head with the precision of nobility, yet the warmth in his expression conveyed something far greater: protection, acknowledgement, and the irrevocable claim of devotion. She curtsied, responding with a composure earned through months of scrutiny and restraint, yet her eyes shone with an exhilaration that could not be masked. Around them, the murmurs grew, some scandalized, others in awe, but the heroine no longer trembled. The declaration had been made, the resolution was forged. When the music tapered into silence, and the orchestra's last notes dissolved into the hush of astonished whispers, they remained at the center, unbowed by the weight of society's judgment. In the quiet between heartbeats, they understood that nothing could undo what had been confessed in courage and honor. The Duke's hand, still lightly resting at her back, spoke of an unwavering resolve, and she, in her modest poise, reflected the rare strength that had first drawn him to her. The night concluded not with applause, but with recognition, silent, potent, and indelible. They had faced the scrutiny of the ton and emerged bound not by fear or expectation, but by the audacity to choose each other. In that choice, the heroine discovered not only love but affirmation of her dignity, and the Duke embraced the thrill and peril of honoring it openly. Society would whisper, speculate, perhaps even condemn, but they had rewritten the rules of propriety with a single deliberate act of courage. In the glittering aftermath, as guests retreated to private corners to parse the events of the evening, The two stood together, unshaken. The declaration was complete, the resolution sealed. Their hearts, once restrained by the rigid constraints of expectation, now beat in deliberate, synchronized defiance of all that would have kept them apart. And in that defiance they found triumph, intimacy, and the unassailable promise of a shared future, radiant even amidst the persistent shadow of the world's scrutiny. Dawn broke over the estate with a quiet brilliance, the first tendrils of sunlight glinting on frost-kissed hedges and illuminating the long avenue of carriages that lined the cobblestone drive. The heroine stood at a tall window, gloved hands resting lightly on the sill, watching the interplay of shadow and light as if it mirrored the turbulence of her own heart. The events of the previous night, the bold declaration, the audacity of defying every expectation, the whispered shock of society, had left her both exhilarated and wary. She understood now the full weight of choice. Love, though radiant, demanded courage as relentless as it was intoxicating. He appeared in the doorway, tall, composed, yet carrying the faint weariness of a man who had spent hours navigating the treacherous currents of the Tun in order to honor the truth of his heart. His eyes met hers with the steadiness of one who has glimpsed both danger and salvation, and she felt the familiar shiver of anticipation, tempered by relief. "The world will speak," he said quietly, closing the distance between them with deliberate calm, "but we have acted in accordance with what we know to be right." His hand extended, steady and inviting, and she placed hers within it, the contact both grounding and electrifying. Outside, the estate stirred with the hum of servants and the distant clatter of wheels on frost-slicked cobbles, but within the grand drawing room, they created a sanctuary impervious to gossip or expectation. Their conversation was measured, every word chosen to convey devotion without arrogance, restraint without diminishment. She spoke of the whispers she had overheard, of the curiosity and envy that had followed every gesture, every glance, and he listened, unwavering, acknowledging the reality of their situation without diminishing the significance of their choice. "I have spent my life observing the world," he said, voice low but commanding, "and I have learned that the bravest acts are not those performed upon battlefields, but in the quiet assertion of one's heart against the tyranny of expectation." The heroine's eyes glistened, the faintest smile touching her lips, a reflection of admiration, relief, and an understanding that had deepened over months of tension, tokens, and whispered encounters. She realized that in him she found not merely a protector, but an equal, a partner capable of both daring and constancy. Their connection, once private and furtive, began to echo outward in subtle but undeniable ways. Invitations that had been withheld, polite distances carefully maintained, were now supplanted by discreet acknowledgement, a careful softening of rigid protocols. Even those who had doubted or whispered their scorn found themselves challenged by the quiet power of steadfast devotion displayed without apology. The heroine, once fragile in the glare of society, now carried herself with unassailable dignity, a reflection of both her inner strength and the affirmation she had earned. One afternoon, beneath the frost-lined branches of the estate's ancient oaks, they walked side by side, hands brushing lightly, fingers occasionally entwining, a language of intimacy built upon trust and defiance. Their conversation turned to dreams long deferred, ambitions tempered by circumstance, and the recognition that, together, they could navigate the constraints of society without surrendering the integrity of their hearts. Each shared glance, each word spoken with deliberate care, solidified a bond that was at once tender and unyielding. In the weeks that followed, whispers continued to circulate, but their potency diminished before the quiet, resolute display of mutual respect and courage. Guests who had once anticipated scandal observed instead the unshakable poise of a couple united, admiration mingling with reluctant acceptance. And the heroine, who had once trembled at every glance, now moved through the world with the assurance of one who had claimed not only love, but the dignity and recognition she had always deserved. At twilight, they stood together on the terrace, the horizon painted with the soft glow of a fading sun. He drew her hand to his chest, the steady beat of his heart a quiet testament to the promises forged in courage and truth. She rested her head lightly against his shoulder, aware that the world might still murmur, might still test them, yet certain that they had endured the trials that mattered most. Their union was not merely of convenience or spectacle, it was the culmination of risk, restraint, and daring honesty, a declaration that courage, once embraced, reshapes every expectation it encounters. And in that serene, breath-held moment, with frost glinting on the garden paths and the estate's spires reaching toward a sky of clear, unwavering light, they recognized the lasting power of their choice. Theirs was a love that would endure, not because society sanctioned it, but because it had been claimed with deliberate, unyielding hearts. The legacy of their courage would ripple quietly through the whispers of the ton, a reminder that the greatest triumphs are those of spirit and conviction, and that even in a world ruled by appearances, the audacity of love could carve its mark upon history, indelible and radiant.